dressed in ragged clothes and sitting quietly on a park bench, Snoop Dogg watched as two officers approached with suspicion etched on their faces. What started as a calm afternoon quickly escalated into a shocking confrontation, revealing deep biases and challenging authority in ways no one expected. Before we dive into this gripping story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you're fascinated by this bold experiment in justice and accountability, don't forget to subscribe. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Central Park, its rays piercing through the leafy canopy above and painting dappled patterns on the ground. The gentle rustling of leaves mixed with the distant hum of city traffic, creating a serene ambiance that contrasted sharply with the looming tension of what was to unfold. On a weathered blue bench near the park's iconic fountain, a figure sat hunched, cloaked in an air of deliberate inconspicuousness. Bookmark: Snoop Dogg, disguised as a homeless man, had chosen this particular spot for his social experiment. His appearance was meticulously planned to blend in and challenge assumptions. A hood pulled low over his face obscured his identity. His coat, frayed at the edges, bore the look of years of neglect, while mismatched sneakers peeked out from beneath the hem of his worn jeans. Beside him rested a crumpled brown paper bag, stained and folded at the edges, adding to the illusion of a man living on the margins. The park bustled with its usual cast of characters, joggers clad in neon gear, parents corralling playful children, and dog walkers navigating their enthusiastic charges. None seemed to notice the figure on the bench, and that suited Snoop just fine. His goal was not to stand out, but to observe. He adjusted the hood slightly, allowing himself a view of the park's main pathway. In his mind, the plan was straightforward. He wanted to test how society, specifically those sworn to protect it, would treat someone they deemed vulnerable or invisible. Would they see the humanity beneath the guise, or would their biases dictate their actions? The minutes ticked by, uneventful at first. Snoop leaned back, his posture relaxed, though his senses remained sharp. He watched as a police cruiser rolled slowly into the park's small parking lot. The vehicle's polished surface reflected the sunlight, a stark contrast to the muted tones of the park. Two officers stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel path. The younger of the two, Officer Martinez, sported a sharp buzz cut and a crisp uniform, his badge gleaming proudly on his chest. His movements were brisk, almost aggressive, as if he carried an unspoken chip on his shoulder. Behind him, Officer Higgins, a stockier man in his 40s with a tired expression and a uniform that bore the stains of countless cups of coffee, followed at a slower pace. Martinez's sharp eyes scanned the park, landing on Snoop almost immediately. He nudged Higgins, muttering under his breath, "Another vagrant. This park is turning into a homeless camp." Higgins sighed, his weariness evident. "Let's just see what he's up to," he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. As they approached, their footsteps grew heavier, their presence deliberate and imposing. Snoop kept his gaze fixed on the ground, feigning obliviousness to their approach. He heard Martinez's sharp voice cut through the quiet air. "You can't sit here all day," Martinez said, his tone clipped. "This is a public park, not your living room." Snoop looked up slowly, his eyes partially hidden in the shadow of his hood. His expression remained neutral, unreadable, as he reached into the brown paper bag beside him. Martinez tensed immediately, his hand instinctively moving toward the baton at his hip. "Easy," Higgins murmured, though his voice carried a note of hesitation rather than authority. Snoop pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, his movements slow and deliberate. Unwrapping it, he took a bite, chewing with quiet precision as if the officers weren't even there. "I said, you can't sit here all day," Martinez repeated, stepping closer, his tone harsher. "You got somewhere to go?" Swallowing his bite, Snoop met the officer's gaze briefly before returning his attention to his sandwich. "I'm not bothering anyone," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "Just eating my lunch." "That's not the point," Martinez shot back, his frustration rising. "People like you make the place look bad. You scare off families, tourists." Higgins sighed again, folding his arms as he watched the exchange unfold. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gruff but less confrontational. Snoop hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly around his sandwich. "Calvin," he said finally. "Calvin brought us." Martinez smirked, his expression dripping with disdain. "Calvin brought us? Huh? You a rapper in your spare time?" Snoop didn't respond, his silence deliberate as he took another bite of his sandwich. His composure seemed to irritate Martinez further. "Let me see some ID," Martinez demanded, his voice sharp. Setting his sandwich down carefully, Snoop reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He handed it to Martinez, who flipped it open with practiced efficiency. The ID inside looked legitimate, but bore little resemblance to the disheveled man sitting before them. Martinez frowned, scrutinizing the ID for a moment before handing it back. "What are you doing here, Broadus?" he asked. "Why aren't you at a shelter or something?" "I like the fresh air," Snoop replied simply. "Is that a crime?" Higgins shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner. "He's not doing anything illegal," he said quietly. "We can't just kick him out." "Maybe not," Martinez muttered, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Snoop. "But we can make it uncomfortable for him." Snoop's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his sandwich and took another slow, deliberate bite. The tension between him and the officers crackled in the air, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. One woman, walking her dog, hesitated as she approached the scene. "He's not hurting anyone," she called out hesitantly. "Why are you bothering him?" Martinez turned toward her, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern. It's a public park," she shot back. "He has as much right to be here as anyone else." Higgins stepped in, raising a placating hand. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. Please move along." The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on her dog's leash. She glanced between Snoop and the officers before shaking her head and walking away, muttering under her breath. Snoop watched her go, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. Setting his sandwich down again, he brushed the crumbs from his lap. "Am I free to go?" he asked, his tone calm but carrying a subtle edge. "You're not under arrest," Higgins said, though Martinez shot him a warning glance. "But you might want to find somewhere else to sit." Snoop nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Martinez for a moment longer than necessary. Rising to his full height, he picked up his paper bag and adjusted the hood of his coat. "Have a nice day," he said, his voice low but pointed, before walking away. As he disappeared down the path, the tension in the park began to ease, but something lingered in the air, a spark of defiance that hadn't been extinguished. Snoop Dogg's steps were measured as he made his way down the winding paths of Central Park, the brown paper bag still tucked securely under his arm. His posture was relaxed, but his senses remained heightened. He wasn't walking away from the confrontation earlier. Instead, he was moving strategically, choosing a new vantage point to continue his experiment. He found another bench tucked beneath a cluster of old oak trees, where the shade provided a semblance of privacy. Sitting down, he placed the bag beside him and leaned back, his hood shielding most of his face. From this spot, he could observe the park while maintaining a calm demeanor that masked the sharp awareness bubbling beneath the surface. The minutes passed, and life in the park continued as usual. Joggers crunched along the gravel paths, their sneakers rhythmically pounding the ground. A pair of them slowed as they approached Snoop's new perch, their conversation trailing off. The man, middle-aged and wearing a sleek fitness tracker, nudged his companion, a woman who cast a wary glance at Snoop. "He looks sketchy," the man whispered, loud enough for Snoop to hear. The woman hesitated. "Should we call someone?" she asked, her tone uncertain. Snoop opened his eyes, letting his gaze flick to them briefly before returning to the sky. He didn't move or react beyond that fleeting glance, but the air grew heavier with tension. The joggers exchanged a look, then quickened their pace, hurrying down the path and leaving Snoop alone once more. But solitude was short-lived. Moments later, a group of teenagers on bikes came tearing down the path, their laughter loud and carefree. They weaved between the trees, their tires skidding on the gravel as they performed careless stunts. One of them, a boy with a shock of bright red hair, spotted Snoop and slowed to a stop, gesturing for his friends to follow. "Check this out," the boy said, grinning as he pointed at Snoop. "Yo, you homeless or something?" Snoop remained still, his expression calm as he observed the boy with detached curiosity. His silence seemed to embolden the teenager, who leaned closer, his grin widening. "What happened?" the boy taunted. "You lose your house playing Fortnite or something?" The laughter from his friends was instant, a cacophony of jeers and taunts. One of them pulled out a phone, holding it up to record the encounter. "Say something for the camera, man," the boy urged, his tone mocking. "Tell us your life story." For a long moment, Snoop said nothing, letting their words hang in the air. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "You should get going," he said, his gaze steady. "This isn't a place for games." The boy hesitated, caught off guard by the calm yet commanding tone. The laughter faltered as the group exchanged uncertain glances. But before they could decide whether to leave or push further, the sound of a police cruiser pulling up nearby drew their attention. The familiar hum of the engines sliced through the atmosphere, and Officer Martinez stepped out first, his sharp eyes locking onto the group. "What's going on here?" he called, his tone sharp. The teenagers scattered like leaves in the wind, their bikes kicking up dust as they pedaled away. Martinez barely spared them a glance, his focus zeroed in on Snoop. Striding toward the bench, his posture radiated frustration and authority. "You again," Martinez said, his voice dripping with irritation. "Couldn't find another park to loiter in?" Snoop didn't move, his relaxed posture unchanged as he regarded Martinez with a calm gaze. "Is sitting on a bench against the law now?" he asked. Martinez's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively resting on the baton at his hip. "You've got a smart mouth," he said, his voice low. "I don't like smart mouths." "Good thing I'm not here to make friends," Snoop replied evenly. Higgins arrived moments later, his expression one of mild annoyance. He looked between his partner and Snoop, clearly already exasperated by the unfolding tension. "What's going on here?" Higgins asked, his tone weary. "Why are we back?" "I don't trust him," Martinez snapped, his eyes never leaving Snoop. "He's up to something." "He's sitting on a bench," Higgins replied, throwing up his hands. "Let it go." Martinez wasn't listening. Taking a step closer, he gestured toward the brown paper bag resting beside Snoop. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but inquisitive. "Lunch," he said simply. "Prove it." Raising an eyebrow, Snoop picked up the paper bag and held it out. Martinez peered inside, his frown deepening as he saw nothing but an apple, a sandwich, and a bottle of water. "You got something else on you?" Martinez pressed, his suspicion palpable. "Something you don't want us to find?" "I've got nothing to hide," Snoop replied, setting the bag down carefully. "But if you're looking for trouble, I'm not the one." Higgins sighed heavily, shaking his head as he turned to his partner. "Let's go," he said firmly. "We've got better things to do." But Martinez hesitated, his instincts screaming that there was more to this man than met the eye. He didn't know what it was yet, but he was determined to find out. "You're awfully calm for someone getting this much attention," Martinez said, his voice sharp. "Most people in your situation would be a little more nervous." "Most people aren't breaking any laws," Snoop replied simply. "Are you saying I should be nervous?" Martinez stepped closer, the tension between them thickening with each passing second. "I'm saying you're acting like you've got nothing to lose," he said. "And that makes me wonder what you're hiding." Snoop remained unfazed, his gaze steady. "You've searched me. You've searched my bag. If you're still looking for something, that's on you." Higgins, standing a few feet away with one hand on the cruiser door, groaned audibly. "Come on," he called to Martinez. "He's not doing anything. Let's move on." For a moment it seemed Martinez might argue. His face was flushed with anger and humiliation, his pride wounded by Snoop's unshakable composure. But then he stepped back reluctantly, his hand dropping from his baton. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. Snoop said nothing as the officers turned and walked back toward their cruiser. But as Martinez reached the car, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. His eyes met Snoop's, and for a brief moment, an unspoken challenge passed between them. The cruiser pulled away, its hum fading into the distance. Snoop watched it go, his expression unreadable. As the police cruiser disappeared down the winding path, Snoop sat motionless on the bench, his hood still partially drawn over his face. His calm exterior betrayed none of the subtle satisfaction he felt inside. The first stage of the experiment was unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. His surroundings seemed to return to normal. The park's usual hum resumed, as if the earlier confrontation had never occurred. Snoop leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes momentarily, but his mind remained sharp, focused on the events yet to come. It didn't take long for the police to circle back. He heard the distant hum of the cruiser before he saw it, the sound blending with the rustling leaves overhead. Opening his eyes, Snoop's gaze flicked to the familiar vehicle as it slowed to a stop near his new perch. This time, only Officer Martinez stepped out. His steps were brisk, his frustration visible in every tense movement as he approached Snoop. His partner, Higgins, stayed in the car, leaning back in his seat with an expression of resigned exasperation. "You again," Martinez said as he came to a stop in front of the bench, his hands resting on his hips. Snoop didn't move. His posture relaxed as he regarded the officer with a calm gaze. "You missed me already?" he asked, his tone tinged with faint amusement. Martinez's jaw tightened, the officer clearly unamused. "You're still here," he said sharply, "still acting suspicious. I don't know what your game is, but I'm going to find out." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. "Sitting on a bench is suspicious now?" he asked. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Martinez shot back, stepping closer. "I think you're making yourself look bad," Snoop replied evenly, his calm demeanor further agitating the officer. From his vantage point in the cruiser, Higgins called out, his voice muffled but firm. "Let it go, Martinez. He's not doing anything illegal." But Martinez ignored him, his focus laser-sharp on Snoop. He gestured toward the empty brown paper bag folded neatly beside him. "What's in the bag?" Snoop raised an eyebrow, his movements deliberate as he picked up the bag and held it out. "Take a look," he said simply. Martinez snatched the bag, peering inside. His frown deepened as he found nothing but an apple core, an empty sandwich wrapper, and a crumpled bottle of water. He tossed it back onto the bench, the force of his frustration causing the items to spill out. "Got something else on you?" Martinez pressed, his voice sharp. "Something you don't want me to find?" Snoop shook his head slowly, his gaze steady. "I've got nothing to hide. You've already checked, twice." Martinez took another step closer, the tension between them thickening with every passing second. His hand rested on the baton at his hip, a silent reminder of his authority. "You're awfully calm for someone getting this much attention," he said, his voice low. "Should I be nervous?" Snoop asked, his tone light but pointed. The officer's jaw tightened. "Most people in your situation wouldn't be so confident. Makes me wonder what you're hiding." "I'm not most people," Snoop replied. Martinez's hand twitched as if itching to act, but a sharp voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Higgins had stepped out of the cruiser, his expression one of mounting frustration as he approached. "We're not doing this, Martinez. He's not breaking the law." "You don't see it, do you?" Martinez snapped, turning to his partner. "There's something off about this guy. The way he talks, the way he moves, it doesn't add up." "Bookmark." Higgins folded his arms, his tone firm but calm. "What doesn't add up is why you're so obsessed with him. He's sitting on a bench, eating lunch. Let it go." Martinez gestured at Snoop, his frustration bubbling over. "You don't get it. People don't act like this unless they're hiding something. Or maybe," Higgins countered, "he's just minding his own business and you can't handle that." Snoop observed the exchange quietly, his expression calm but his mind racing. He noted every word, every gesture, filing them away for later. "You know what?" Martinez said suddenly, reaching for his radio. "Let's see what the system says about him." Snoop raised an eyebrow but said nothing as Martinez pressed the button on his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need a record check on an individual named Calvin Broadus, ID provided earlier." The radio crackled faintly, the dispatcher's voice coming through a moment later. "Copy that, Unit 12. Stand by." Higgins groaned audibly, throwing up his hands. "You're making this into something it's not," he muttered. "This is going to come back on us." "Then he shouldn't have anything to worry about." Martinez shot back, his gaze locked on Snoop. Snoop leaned back on the bench, folding his arms as he studied the officer. "You're very determined," he said calmly. "Almost flattering." "Don't try to play me," Martinez snapped, his tone sharp. The radio crackled again, cutting through the tension. "Unit 12, no records found under the name Calvin Broadus matching the provided ID." Martinez stiffened, his hand tightening on the radio. "What do you mean, no records?" "Exactly what it sounds like," the dispatcher replied. "No matches in the system. Either the ID is fake, or there's an error in the database." Higgins's face darkened, and he turned to his partner. "That's it. We're done here," he said firmly. "We're not turning this into a witch hunt." Martinez's suspicion only deepened. his frustration bubbling over. "He's lying," he said, pointing at Snoop. "That ID is fake, and he knows it." "If that's true," Snoop replied, his tone calm but pointed, "then why didn't you spot it earlier?" Martinez opened his mouth to respond, but Higgins cut him off. "Enough," he said sharply, grabbing Martinez's arm and steering him toward the cruiser. "Let it go before you make this worse." Reluctantly, Martinez allowed himself to be led away, but his glare remained fixed on Snoop. "This isn't over," he muttered as he climbed into the car. Snoop watched the cruiser pull away, his expression unreadable. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out a small device, its sleek surface gleaming faintly in the light. A faint smirk crossed his lips as he turned it over in his hand. The game was far from over. Snoop remained seated on the bench, the faint smirk lingering on his lips as he watched the police cruiser disappear into the distance. He tucked the small device back into his coat pocket, its presence a silent reassurance of the plan he had set into motion. The afternoon light began to shift, the sun casting longer shadows across Central Park. The park's natural rhythm continued unabated. Joggers, dog walkers, and tourists filled the pathways, oblivious to the subtle but tense drama that had been unfolding. For Snoop, the quiet moments were a chance to reflect and prepare for what was next. He knew the officers would return. Curiosity and suspicion were powerful motivators. Sure enough, it wasn't long before the familiar hum of the police cruiser returned. Snoop's expression remained neutral, his posture relaxed as the vehicle slowed to a stop near his bench once more. This time, Officer Martinez stepped out alone. His partner Higgins remained in the cruiser, his body language indicating frustration and reluctance. Martinez's steps were purposeful, his face set in a mask of determination. "You've got some nerve," Martinez said as he approached, his tone sharp. Snoop didn't look up immediately, instead brushing a few crumbs from his lap. Finally, he raised his gaze, meeting the officer's glare with calm composure. "Back so soon?" he asked. "I thought you'd had enough." Martinez's jaw tightened. "We're not done," he said, his voice low. "That ID you gave us, it doesn't exist. Care to explain?" Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Maybe your system's broken," he replied. "Or maybe you're just looking for something that's not there." "Don't get smart with me," Martinez snapped, stepping closer. "You think this is a game? I think you're the one making it into one," Snoop said evenly. The tension between them crackled, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who slowed their steps to observe from a distance. Snoop noticed a jogger tying their shoe nearby, their eyes flicking between him and the officer. Higgins finally stepped out of the cruiser, his expression a mix of annoyance and concern. "What are you doing, Martinez?" he asked, his tone weary. "We've already checked him out." "Let it go." "I'm not letting this go," Martinez shot back, his eyes never leaving Snoop. "There's something off about him, and I'm going to figure out what it is." "He's sitting on a bench," Higgins replied, throwing up his hands, eating a sandwich. "You're turning this into a circus." Martinez ignored his partner, turning his attention back to Snoop. "What's your deal?" he demanded. "Why are you here? Why this park, this bench? Do I need a reason?" Snoop asked calmly. "I wasn't aware public spaces came with prerequisites." Martinez's frustration boiled over. "You're too calm," he said, his voice rising. "Too calculated. People don't just act like this unless they're planning something." "Planning what?" Snoop asked, his tone measured. "A picnic? A peaceful afternoon?" Higgins stepped between them, his patience wearing thin. "That's enough," he said firmly. "We don't have probable cause for anything. Drop it." Martinez's grip on his baton tightened, but he reluctantly took a step back. His face was flushed with anger, the weight of his wounded pride evident. As he turned back toward the cruiser, he muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." Snoop watched him go, his expression calm but observant. He took mental notes of every word, every movement, cataloging them for later. The minutes passed, the tension lingering in the air even after the officers had left. Snoop leaned back against the bench, his gaze sweeping over the park. He noticed a man in a gray hoodie standing near the edge of the trees, his movements cautious as he glanced around. The man stepped forward, stopping a few feet from the bench. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice low. Snoop took a moment before replying, his tone casual but deliberate. "About as expected," he said. "They're suspicious, but they haven't figured anything out yet." The man nodded, his hands tucked into his hoodie pockets. You think they'll come back? They always do, Snoop replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. Curiosity gets the better of them. The man hesitated, his brow furrowing. You sure about this? You're pushing them pretty hard. That's the point, Snoop said, his voice calm but firm. I want to see how far they'll go. Nearby, a jogger paused to adjust their shoelaces, their attention briefly flicking to the two men before continuing on their way. The man in the hoodie shifted uncomfortably, his posture tense. Just be careful, he said. If this goes sideways, it won't, Snoop interrupted, his tone carrying quiet authority. I've got this. The man nodded reluctantly, retreating back into the shadows of the trees. Snoop remained on the bench, his gaze returning to the path ahead. He didn't have to wait long before the hum of the police cruiser reached his ears again. The vehicle rolled to a stop nearby, and Martinez was out before it had even fully halted. His steps were brisk, his frustration palpable as he approached Snoop for the third time that day. You again, Martinez said, his tone sharp. His eyes flicked to the empty brown paper bag before returning to Snoop's face. Didn't we just have this conversation? Snoop looked up, his expression neutral. We did, he said evenly. I didn't realize sitting on a bench was grounds for a second visit. Martinez's face darkened. You're still here, still acting suspicious. I don't know what your game is, but I'm going to find out. Good luck with that, Snoop replied, his tone calm but pointed. Martinez's frustration boiled over, his voice rising as he stepped closer. You think you're clever? He demanded. You think you can just sit here, making me look like an idiot? Snoop tilted his head slightly. I think you're doing that all on your own, he said softly. The words landed like a slap, and Martinez's face flushed with anger. Higgins stepped in, grabbing his partner's arm to pull him back. Enough, Higgins said firmly. We're done here. No, we're not, Martinez snapped, shaking off Higgins's grip. This guy's playing us. I can feel it. Feel it all you want, Higgins replied, his tone sharp. You don't have anything on him. Leave it alone. For a moment, it looked like Martinez might argue, his pride warring with his better judgment. Finally, he stepped back, his hand reluctantly dropping from his baton. This isn't over, he muttered, his glare fixed on Snoop as he stormed back to the cruiser. Snoop watched him go, his expression unreadable. He leaned back against the bench, his calm composure unshaken as he waited for what was sure to come next. Snoop's composure never wavered as he sat on the bench, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the police cruiser had disappeared moments ago. Around him, the natural hum of Central Park continued. Children's laughter from the playground, the rhythmic pounding of joggers' feet, and the occasional bark of a dog. To an observer, Snoop was simply another figure enjoying the park. But to him, the environment was a stage, and the drama was far from over. The sky was beginning to shift from afternoon brightness to the warm hues of early evening. Shadows stretched longer across the pathways, and a chill crept into the breeze. Snoop adjusted his hood slightly, leaning back with an air of nonchalance that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. He knew they'd be back. Martinez's demeanor had made that clear. And right on cue, the hum of the police cruiser returned, louder this time as it pulled to a stop in almost the exact spot as before. The door opened with force, and Officer Martinez stepped out, his posture rigid with frustration. He didn't wait for Higgins this time, striding purposefully toward Snoop. Martinez's face was set, his eyes burning with the kind of determination that blurred judgment. His partner followed a moment later, his steps slower, his expression weary. Higgins seemed to be hanging on to the last thread of patience he had for Martinez's obsession. You're still here, Martinez said, his tone accusing, as if Snoop's presence alone was an affront. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze calm as he looked up. It's a public park, he said simply. Where else would I be? Martinez's lips tightened into a thin line. Don't get smart with me, he snapped, his voice sharper than before. You're still acting suspicious, and I don't like it. Snoop leaned back, his posture relaxed. You keep using that word, he said. Suspicious. What exactly does that mean? It means you're up to something, Martinez shot back. People don't just sit around like this unless they've got a plan. Maybe I'm planning to finish enjoying my day, Snoop replied, his tone measured. Higgins finally stepped forward, placing a hand on his partner's shoulder in an attempt to defuse the situation. Martinez, enough, he said, his tone firm but tired. We don't have anything on him. We're just harassing him at this point." Martinez shrugged off Higgins's hand, his focus still locked on Snoop. "He's hiding something," he said, his voice rising. "You don't see it because you're not looking closely enough." "I see a guy sitting on a bench," Higgins replied, his voice tinged with exasperation. "That's all." Martinez ignored him, taking another step closer to Snoop. "What's your deal?" he demanded. "Why are you so calm? Why aren't you nervous?" "Why should I be nervous?" Snoop asked. "I haven't done anything wrong." "That's exactly my point," Martinez snapped, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "People don't act like you unless they've got something to hide." Snoop's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe you're just not used to people who don't flinch under pressure." Martinez's hand twitched toward the baton at his hip, his frustration boiling over. The exchange had drawn the attention of several passers-by who paused at a distance to observe. Whispers rippled through the small crowd as phones were discreetly raised, cameras capturing the tense standoff. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Martinez said, his voice low and dangerous. "Sitting here, acting like you're better than me." "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Snoop replied evenly. "But I do think you've got something to prove." The words hit Martinez like a slap. His face flushed with anger, and he took another step forward, towering over Snoop. "You think this is a game?" he demanded. "You think you can just sit there making me look like a fool?" "I think you're doing that all on your own," Snoop said calmly, his tone cutting without raising his voice. Higgins moved quickly, stepping between the two men and pushing Martinez back slightly. "That's enough," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We're done here." But Martinez wasn't ready to back down. He gestured toward Snoop, his frustration spilling over. "He's hiding something," he said. "I know it." "Even if he is," Higgins countered, his voice sharp, "it's not our job to harass him until we find something. We don't have probable cause." Martinez's jaw tightened, his pride and frustration warring with his better judgment. For a long moment, he didn't move, his hand still resting on his baton. "Let it go," Higgins said again, his tone firm. "We've got better things to do." Finally, Martinez stepped back, his glare never leaving Snoop. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low. Snoop watched silently as Martinez turned and stormed back to the cruiser, his shoulders tense with barely contained anger. Higgins followed, shaking his head as he climbed into the passenger seat. As the cruiser pulled away, Snoop remained seated, his posture unshaken. He knew the confrontation wasn't truly over. Martinez's obsession wouldn't let it be. The officer's pride had been wounded, and his suspicion had become a personal vendetta. Reaching into his coat pocket, Snoop pulled out the small device once more. He turned it over in his hand, the faint smirk returning to his lips. The situation was unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. The onlookers began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with speculation about what they had just witnessed. A jogger approached cautiously, their curiosity getting the better of them. "Are you okay?" they asked, their tone hesitant. Snoop nodded, slipping the device back into his pocket. "I'm fine," he said, his voice calm. The jogger hesitated for a moment longer before walking away, their expressions still one of uncertainty. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Snoop stood, stretching slightly before tucking the empty paper bag under his arm. He began walking down the path, his steps slow and deliberate. He knew Martinez would return. It was only a matter of time. But Snoop wasn't in a hurry. He had all the time in the world. The orange and purple hues of the setting sun cast an ethereal glow over Central Park as Snoop found a new bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. The air had grown cooler, signaling the approach of evening, but he remained unbothered. His hood was pushed back slightly, revealing more of his face, but he still appeared every bit the man society might overlook. A deliberate part of his plan. From this vantage point, Snoop had a clear view of the park's main pathway. He placed the crumpled paper bag beside him, though its contents were long gone. Despite its emptiness, it served as an emblem of the narrative he was crafting. Ordinary, unassuming, and entirely misunderstood. It wasn't long before the hum of the police cruiser returned, louder and closer than before. Snoop remained motionless, his calm gaze fixed on the horizon as the vehicle came into view. The cruiser pulled to a stop near the path, and Officer Martinez stepped out with the same aggressive energy he'd displayed earlier. This time, however, Martinez approached alone. His partner, Officer Higgins, stayed in the car, his posture one of exhaustion and defeat. Snoop could tell that Higgins had finally had enough of his partner's obsession. Martinez's boots crunched against the gravel path as he strode toward the bench. His hand rested on his baton, the muscles in his jaw flexing with barely concealed frustration. When he reached Snoop, he stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over the seated figure. "You've got some nerve," Martinez said, his voice low and tense. Snoop looked up slowly, his expression neutral. "It's a public park," he replied. "I didn't realize sitting on a bench was such a bold move." Martinez ignored the remark, his eyes narrowing. "You've been playing games with me all day," he said. "And I'm done. You're going to tell me who you really are, or I'll make sure you regret it." Snoop tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You really want to know who I am?" he asked. "Enough with the smart remarks," Martinez snapped. "Let me see some real ID this time. No tricks, no fake names, just the truth." Slowly, Snoop reached into his coat pocket. His movements were deliberate, his calm demeanor never wavering. Martinez tensed, his hand tightening on his baton as he watched every motion, ready to react at the slightest sign of a threat. But Snoop didn't pull out a weapon or another questionable ID. Instead, he produced a sleek black smartphone, its polished surface catching the last rays of sunlight as he held it up. "Here's the thing," Snoop said, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I don't need to prove anything to you. But since you're so determined to know the truth, I'll give it to you." He tapped the screen a few times, and a video began to play. The audio was crystal clear, each word and inflection captured in stunning detail. Martinez leaned in slightly, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The footage was of him. It showed Martinez towering over Snoop earlier in the day, his tone aggressive as he demanded answers. The exchange was captured from multiple angles, suggesting the presence of hidden cameras or collaborators. "What is this?" Martinez demanded, his voice rising as he pointed at the screen. "This," Snoop replied, "is a live stream. It's been running all day. Every interaction we've had, every word you've said, has been broadcast to millions of people." Martinez's face went pale, his grip on the baton faltering. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. Snoop stood slowly, his full height imposing as he faced the officer. Slipping the phone back into his pocket, his expression was calm but unyielding. "I'm not Calvin Broadus," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm Snoop Dogg." For a moment, Martinez seemed frozen, his mind racing as he tried to process the words. "Snoop Dogg," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "You're kidding." "I never kid about things like this," Snoop replied. "This has been a social experiment, testing how people like you treat those you think are beneath you." Martinez's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The calm demeanor, the quiet confidence, the deliberate way Snoop had handled every interaction, it all made sense now. The realization hit Martinez like a freight train. "You set me up," he said finally, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and panic. "I didn't set you up," Snoop replied evenly. "I gave you a choice. Every action you took, every word you said was your own. All I did was observe." Martinez's face turned red, his frustration boiling over. "You had no right to do this," he spat. "I had every right," Snoop countered, his tone unwavering. "You're a public servant, sworn to protect and serve. But instead of doing your job, you chose to harass someone you thought was powerless." The officer took a step back, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. "You can't use this," he said desperately. "This is entrapment. It's illegal." "It's not entrapment," Snoop said calmly. "I didn't force you to do anything. And as for legality, my lawyers would be happy to explain why you don't have a case." Martinez's panic deepened as the full scope of the situation sank in. The live stream, the audience, the undeniable evidence, it was all too much. He had thought he was in control, but now it was clear that Snoop had been several steps ahead the entire time. Outside the park, a small crowd had begun to gather. News crews arrived, their cameras trained on the unfolding scene. Reporters whispered into microphones, their excitement palpable as they described the confrontation. Martinez glanced toward the growing crowd, his face contorted with humiliation. He realized, too late, that his every move was now a public spectacle. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking as he pointed a finger at Snoop. "You won't get away with this." Snoop's expression didn't change. "It's already over," he said simply. "The world's watching now." The words hung in the air, their calm defiance cutting through the chaos. Martinez's frustration turned to anger, but he could do nothing as the cameras continued to roll. Behind him, Higgins finally stepped forward, his face pale as he realized the scale of what was unfolding. "We need to leave," he said quietly, grabbing Martinez by the arm. "Now." Martinez resisted for a moment, his pride refusing to let him walk away. But the murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their condemnation rippling through the air. Reluctantly, he allowed himself to be led away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. As the cruiser pulled out of the park for what would be the last time that day, Snoop stood near the bench, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. His gaze swept over the crowd, the officers and the news crews. The spark he had lit had turned into a fire, and it was only the beginning. The atmosphere in Central Park had shifted dramatically. The quiet, serene paths were now abuzz with chatter and the clicking of camera shutters. News crews had arrived in droves, their vans parked along the perimeter of the park, antennas raised to broadcast live. A throng of curious onlookers gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, anger, and disbelief. At the center of it all stood Snoop Dogg, his calm and composed demeanor unchanged. The weight of the moment did not faze him. If anything, it seemed to energize him. With his hood now fully pushed back, his unmistakable identity was on full display. The murmurs of the crowd confirmed as much. "That's really Snoop Dogg," someone exclaimed, their voice carrying over the hum of the growing assembly. "He set this up on purpose," another added, their tone equal parts awe and indignation. Meanwhile, Officer Martinez sat in the police cruiser, his face pale and his body slumped in defeat. His partner, Officer Higgins, stood nearby, his arms folded and his expression grim. The weight of the situation had settled heavily on both men, but it was Martinez who bore the brunt of the public's ire. The crowd's mood had shifted from intrigue to condemnation. Words like abuse of power and disgrace rippled through the gathering. Phones were raised, recording every moment, their cameras trained on the police cruiser as if capturing a symbol of systemic failure. Martinez's hands trembled as he buried his face in them, the reality of his actions crashing down around him. He had started the day in control, wielding authority without question. Now, stripped of the illusion of power, he was exposed, his actions laid bare for all to see. Snoop, standing near the fountain, finally turned to address the crowd. His voice, steady and deliberate, carried above the noise. "This isn't about one bad officer," he began, his words drawing immediate silence from the assembly. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It's about accountability." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices filled with a mix of relief and frustration. Many had likely experienced their own brushes with unfair treatment, and Snoop's words struck a deeply personal chord. Nearby, a woman in a sharp suit emerged from the growing throng. Her stride was purposeful, her presence commanding. The badge clipped to her belt identified her as Captain Jane Monroe of the NYPD's Internal Affairs Division. The crowd parted for her as she approached Martinez and Higgins. Her sharp gaze locked onto the former, her expression unreadable but heavy with authority. "You've made quite a mess," Monroe said coldly as she stopped beside the cruiser. Martinez looked up, his face pale and his expression a mixture of panic and defiance. "Ma'am, save it," Monroe interrupted, holding up a hand to silence him. "I've already seen the footage, and I think the public has made their opinion pretty clear." She gestured toward the crowd, who responded with a mixture of boos and cheers. The cameras zoomed in on the interaction, the moment unfolding live before an audience of millions. Monroe's gaze softened slightly as she turned to Snoop. "Mr. Dogg," she said, her tone professional, but tinged with respect. "On behalf of the department, I'd like to apologize for what you've been through today. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be dealt with." Snoop nodded, his expression serious. "It's not about me," he replied. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Monroe nodded in agreement, then turned back to Martinez. "Hand over your badge and weapon," she said, her voice firm and unyielding. Martinez's face went pale. "What?" he stammered, his voice trembling. "You can't be serious." "Do it," Monroe snapped. "You're on administrative leave pending a full investigation. And trust me, this investigation will be thorough." With shaking hands, Martinez unclipped his badge and gun, handing them over with a look of utter defeat. The crowd's cheers swelled as he relinquished the symbols of his authority, the sound reverberating through the park like a thunderclap. Martinez lowered his head as Monroe gestured for another officer to escort him away. The crowd parted once more, their phones capturing every step as he was led to another cruiser. It was the ultimate walk of shame, a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked power. Snoop turned his attention back to the gathered crowd, his voice cutting through the din like a beacon. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning. If we want real change, we have to hold people accountable, not just when they're caught, but every single day." The applause was deafening, the crowd's energy electric. People raised their hands in solidarity, some shouting words of encouragement while others nodded silently, their faces alight with hope. Nearby, Mrs. Patel, an elderly woman who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, approached Snoop cautiously. She clutched her purse tightly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I had no idea who you were," she said, her eyes glistening with emotion. "But what you did today is brave. You didn't have to do this." Snoop's expression softened as he looked at her. "Sometimes the best way to understand a problem is to experience it firsthand," he said. "And sometimes the only way to fix it is to shine a light on it." She nodded, her gratitude evident. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're standing up for all the people who can't." As the crowd began to disperse, the energy lingering in the air was palpable. The bench where Snoop had sat earlier became an unlikely landmark, with visitors pausing to take photos or leave notes of their own. Captain Monroe approached Snoop once more, her expression serious. "Mr. Dogg," she began, "I want to personally assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. The department doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior." Snoop nodded but didn't smile. "I hope so," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Because it's not just about one officer, it's about the culture that allows these things to happen." Monroe hesitated, clearly unsettled by the weight of his words. "I understand," she said finally, "and I'll make sure your concerns are heard." With that, she walked away, leaving Snoop standing near the fountain. He glanced toward the bench, where a scrap of paper fluttered in the breeze. Approaching it, he scribbled a quick note and tucked it under the edge of the seat. The note read, "To the next person who sits here, your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As the evening deepened, the park began to quiet. The crowd that had gathered earlier was thinning, though the tension and energy from the day's events still lingered in the air. For Snoop Dogg, the calm after the storm was a moment to reflect on the day's significance, though his work was far from over. The bench he had sat on for most of the day now bore a new meaning. It wasn't just a seat anymore. It had become a symbol of resistance, accountability, and the quiet defiance of someone determined to challenge an unjust system. While Snoop prepared to leave, the scene around him painted a vivid picture of how far his experiment had reached. A father walked by with his young daughter perched on his shoulders. The little girl waved at Snoop, and he nodded back, the faintest smile breaking his otherwise serious expression. Nearby, a group of young people huddled together, scrolling through their phones, likely sharing the live-streamed video that had already begun spreading like wildfire across social media. Snoop had no illusions about what lay ahead. This wasn't just about Martinez or even the NYPD. It was about a larger culture of unchecked power and bias, something far more deeply ingrained than a single day's events could resolve. The news vans remained parked on the perimeter of the park, their reporters tirelessly recounting the story for their late-night broadcasts. At least 3 of them had approached Snoop for an interview, but he had politely declined each time. He wasn't interested in a soundbite or a fleeting moment of fame. Instead, he focused on the greater narrative he had set into motion. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket with notifications, a mix of supportive messages, calls, and a growing wave of online comments. He briefly glanced at the screen, noting trending hashtags like accountability matters and justice for all. The video was everywhere, an unfiltered, undeniable record of what had transpired. Back at the police station, the fallout had already begun. Captain Jane Monroe sat in a dimly lit conference room with a team of internal affairs officers. The live stream played on a large screen before them, the events of the day replaying in stark detail. "This is bad," one officer muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "No," Monroe corrected, her tone sharp. "This is accountability." Her eyes didn't leave the screen as she watched Martinez's behavior unfold, his escalating frustration and the undeniable bias in his actions. Every word, every gesture was scrutinized, and the mood in the room grew heavier with each passing second. "There's no way around this," Monroe continued. "He violated protocol, ignored probable cause, and harassed someone without justification. This isn't just a disciplinary issue, it's a systemic one. We need to do better." The officers around her nodded solemnly, their expressions grim. Monroe knew this was just the beginning of a long, painful process of rebuilding trust, not just for the department but for the community they served. Meanwhile, Martinez sat alone in a holding room at the station, his badge and weapon confiscated, his head buried in his hands. The humiliation of the day weighed on him like a boulder, crushing what little pride he had left. His thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of how everything had spiraled so far out of control. He hadn't anticipated Snoop's calm defiance or the magnitude of the public's reaction. For years, Martinez had operated under the belief that his authority was unchallengeable. Today, that illusion had been shattered. Higgins entered the room, his expression unreadable as he closed the door behind him. "You really messed up today," Higgins said bluntly, breaking the silence. Martinez looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and defeat. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped. "But that guy, he's not just some random person. He was trying to make me look like a fool." Higgins crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "You didn't need any help with that," he said evenly. "You let your pride and bias get the better of you. And now the whole world knows it." Martinez's jaw clenched, but he had no response. He couldn't argue with the truth, no matter how much he wanted to. Back in the park, Snoop finally rose from the bench. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars of the evening began to twinkle faintly in the darkening sky. He adjusted his coat and tucked the paper bag under his arm, his steps slow but purposeful as he walked toward the park's exit. As he passed by the news crews, a few reporters called out to him, hoping for a final comment. Snoop paused, turning slightly toward the cameras. "This isn't about embarrassing anyone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about holding up a mirror to ourselves as a society. If we don't like what we see, it's on us to change it." The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their microphones capturing every word. Snoop offered no further explanation, turning back to continue his quiet exit from the park. The bench he left behind became an unexpected landmark. Visitors stopped to take pictures, and some even left notes of their own, inspired by the simple message Snoop had written. "Your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." For many, the bench symbolized the power of standing up against injustice, even in the smallest of ways. It reminded them that dignity and respect were not privileges to be granted, but rights to be demanded. Online, the video of the day's events continued to spread, sparking intense debates across social media, news outlets, and community forums. Some praised Snoop's boldness, applauding his creative approach to exposing systemic issues. Others questioned the ethics of his experiment, arguing that it bordered on entrapment. But no matter which side of the argument people fell on, one thing was undeniable. The conversation about accountability and bias in law enforcement had been reignited on a massive scale. As Snoop exited the park, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out and opened the door for him, but before climbing in, Snoop turned to take one last look at the park. "This is just one bench," he murmured to himself, more a reflection than a statement. One moment. But every big change starts with something small. He climbed into the SUV, the door closing softly behind him. As the vehicle pulled away, the faint glow of the park's lampposts disappeared into the distance. Snoop pulled out his phone, scrolling through the thousands of comments pouring into the live stream. Messages of support, outrage, and reflection filled the screen. He paused to type a response. "Change starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going." The events of the day rippled far beyond Central Park. By the time Snoop Dogg's SUV disappeared into the city streets, the video from his live stream had reached every corner of the internet. News outlets replayed the footage on an endless loop, headlines blaring phrases like Snoop Dogg's dog exposes police bias and social experiment sparks national debate. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. For many, Snoop's bold actions were an eye-opening reminder of the systemic issues woven into the fabric of law enforcement and society as a whole. Advocacy groups hailed the experiment as a watershed moment, using the footage to amplify calls for reform. Others criticized the approach, labeling it as antagonistic and questioning whether it had done more harm than good. But for Snoop, the mission had never been about pleasing everyone. It had been about starting a conversation too many had avoided for too long. Back at the NYPD headquarters, Captain Jane Monroe wasted no time initiating a thorough investigation. The department was under intense scrutiny, not just from the public, but also from internal and external watchdogs. Officer Martinez, now suspended and stripped of his authority, sat in a conference room with his attorney. Across the table, Monroe and two members of Internal Affairs reviewed the evidence. The atmosphere was heavy with tension. "You've seen the footage," Monroe began, her tone cold and precise. "Do you deny that your behavior was unprofessional and biased?" Martinez hesitated, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. I didn't handle it well," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's putting it lightly," Monroe retorted, her sharp gaze fixed on him. "You escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. You harassed a civilian who wasn't breaking any laws, and you ignored your partner's attempts to de-escalate. Do you understand the damage you've caused, not just to yourself, but to this department?" Martinez's jaw clenched, but he nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Monroe's expression softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "This isn't just about you, Officer Martinez. It's about a culture that allows this kind of behavior to happen in the first place. We're going to address that culture, starting now." The consequences for Martinez were severe. Beyond his suspension, he faced mandatory training on de-escalation and implicit bias, and his future with the department hung in the balance. But Monroe knew this wasn't enough. The department's credibility was at stake, and she was determined to lead the charge for systemic change. For Officer Higgins, the fallout was a sobering wake-up call. Though he had tried to temper Martinez's actions, he realized that simply standing by wasn't enough. He vowed to be more proactive in calling out inappropriate behavior and ensuring that the badge he wore truly stood for justice. On his next patrol, Higgins walked with a renewed sense of purpose. When he encountered a man sitting on a bench, much like Snoop had been, he approached with an entirely different mindset. "Good evening," Higgins said, his tone calm and polite. "Just checking in. How's your day going?" The man looked up, startled but appreciative. "It's fine," he said. "Thanks for asking." Higgins nodded, offering a small smile before continuing on his way. He had no idea if the man realized the significance of the gesture, but for Higgins, it was a small step in the right direction. Meanwhile, the bench in Central Park had taken on a life of its own. Tourists and locals alike stopped to take photos of it, often sitting down to read the message Snoop had left behind. "To the next person who sits here, your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The bench became a symbol of quiet resistance and hope, its simple message resonating with those who had faced discrimination or felt powerless. Over the weeks that followed, people began leaving their own messages, scraps of paper, post-it notes, even letters addressed to no one in particular. One note read, "I've been homeless for 3 years. This bench gave me hope. Thank you." Another said, "I lost my job last month. Reading this reminded me that I'm not invisible." Snoop, watching the movement grow from afar, was deeply moved by how his small act had sparked something far greater. At a press conference days later, Snoop addressed the incident publicly for the first time. Standing before a sea of reporters and flashing cameras in Times Square, he spoke with the same calm authority he had displayed in the park. "This wasn't about embarrassing anyone," he began. "It was about holding up a mirror to ourselves as a society. And if we don't like what we see, it's on us to change it." The crowd hung on his every word. Too often, People in positions of power forget what that power is supposed to represent. It's not a weapon, it's a responsibility. A responsibility to serve, to protect, and to treat every individual with dignity and respect. That's what this experiment was about. A reporter raised their hand, their voice cutting through the murmurs of the audience. "Mr. Dogg, do you think this one incident will lead to real change?" Snoop paused, his gaze steady. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "But every big change starts with a small spark." This was one spark. Now it's up to all of us to keep the fire burning. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the square. Snoop stepped back from the podium, letting the moment sink in before leaving the stage. The video of the incident continued to circulate online, sparking debates and conversations across the country. While some argued about the ethics of Snoop's experiment, the majority agreed on one thing. It had forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, authority, and the way society treated its most vulnerable members. Back in Central Park, life slowly returned to normal, though the bench where it had all started remained a quiet monument to the day's events. The messages left behind grew more numerous, their words carrying the weight of countless untold stories. One afternoon, an older man sat down on the bench, his expression weary but contemplative. As he read the messages, he pulled out a pen and scribbled his own. "I've been a cop for 25 years. I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to be better. We all should." For Snoop, the day in Central Park was just one chapter in a larger journey. He knew the work ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew it was necessary. As he prepared for his next step, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. The spark had been lit, and now it was up to the world to decide what to do with it. Weeks had passed since the day in Central Park, but the echoes of Snoop Dogg's experiment were far from fading. The video continued to circulate, becoming a cornerstone in discussions about accountability and systemic bias. News segments, podcasts, and social media posts dissected every moment of the live stream, often replaying Snoop's calm defiance and Officer Martinez's unraveling. Bookmark, what started as one man sitting on a park bench had become a global conversation. Communities across the country held town halls, activists organized rallies, and public officials faced mounting pressure to address the issues the video exposed. For Snoop, this was exactly the outcome he had hoped for. One chilly morning, Snoop returned to Central Park, his presence quieter this time, without the hood or disguise. The park looked as it always did, serene and bustling with life. He approached the same bench, now adorned with handwritten notes and flowers left by strangers who had been moved by the story. A group of school children on a field trip stopped nearby, their teacher pointing to the bench as she explained its significance. "This is where it happened," she said, her voice carrying over the light chatter of the kids. "It's a reminder that one person can spark change." Snoop lingered in the background, listening. He didn't step forward or introduce himself. This wasn't about him. It was about the message. At a community center in Brooklyn, another ripple of the experiment was unfolding. A panel discussion on police reform had drawn an unexpectedly large crowd. Among the attendees were police officers, activists, and everyday citizens, all gathered to exchange perspectives and find common ground. One of the speakers was Officer Higgins. His participation had raised some eyebrows, but his words carried weight. "What happened in Central Park wasn't just about one bad decision," Higgins said, his tone measured. "It was about a mindset, one we've all been guilty of at some point. But change starts with recognizing that and committing to doing better. That's why I'm here, not to defend the mistakes of the past, but to be part of the solution." His honesty earned him hesitant applause, and as the discussion continued, the walls between the attendees seemed to soften. The changes weren't confined to community conversations. At NYPD headquarters, Captain Jane Monroe had initiated a series of reforms, starting with mandatory de-escalation and bias training for all officers. While these were small steps, they marked a shift in a department that had long resisted change. "We can't fix everything overnight," Monroe said in an internal memo to her team. "But if we don't start somewhere, we'll never get anywhere." What happened in Central Park was a wake-up call. Let's make sure we don't hit snooze. Even Officer Martinez, now on extended leave, had begun reflecting on his actions. Though he had initially bristled at the criticism, the overwhelming public response forced him to confront the reality of his behavior. Sitting in a quiet cafe one afternoon, Martinez watched the live-streamed footage again, this time without defensiveness clouding his judgment. He saw his own words, his own actions, and the harm they had caused. For the first time, he felt a pang of regret, not just for what had happened to him, but for how he had treated others. For Snoop, the weeks following the experiment were a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and planning. The spotlight wasn't new to him, but this time it carried a different weight. He wasn't promoting an album or headlining a show, he was championing a cause. At a charity gala in Los Angeles, Snoop addressed an audience of influential figures from various industries. "This isn't just about police reform," he said, his voice carrying through the grand ballroom. "It's about how we treat each other as human beings. It's about looking at the person next to you and seeing their story, their struggles, their worth, not just the labels society puts on them." His words drew a standing ovation, and the event raised millions for initiatives aimed at addressing systemic injustice. Back in Central Park, the bench had become a destination for visitors from around the world. It was no longer just a physical object, but a symbol of resilience and accountability. One day, a young woman sat on the bench, her expression contemplative. She carried a notebook, its pages filled with sketches and notes. She had traveled from a small town in Kansas, inspired by the message Snoop had left behind. As she placed a fresh flower beside the other tributes, a man walking by paused to ask her about the bench. "This isn't just a bench," she said, her voice steady. "It's proof that change can start anywhere, even in the smallest moments. It's a reminder that our stories matter." The impact of Snoop's experiment wasn't confined to the United States. News outlets in Europe, Asia, and Africa picked up the story, sparking similar conversations in their own regions. Activists in London organized a bench project, placing messages of hope and accountability on public seating throughout the city. In Johannesburg, a group of university students created a short film inspired by Snoop's actions, using their own experiences with authority figures to craft a narrative of resilience. Even in countries where freedom of speech was restricted, whispers of the story found their way into private conversations and underground movements. For Snoop, the bench was only the beginning. He launched an initiative called Your Story Matters, a platform dedicated to amplifying the voices of those who had been silenced or overlooked. Through partnerships with community leaders, nonprofits, and social media influencers, the initiative provided resources, support, and a platform for individuals to share their experiences. "Your story matters," Snoop said in a promotional video for the initiative. "Because when we listen to each other, when we see each other, that's when real change happens." The platform quickly gained traction, becoming a hub for storytelling and advocacy. Stories poured in from all over the world, ranging from tales of injustice to moments of triumph. Months after the experiment, Snoop returned to Central Park one last time. This time, the park was quiet, with only a few scattered visitors enjoying the crisp autumn air. He approached the bench, now slightly weathered from its newfound fame, and sat down. Reaching into his coat pocket, he pulled out a pen and a small notebook. He scribbled a quick message and tucked it beneath one of the notes already left behind. Before rising, he took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the park. The weight of what had been accomplished was tangible, but he knew there was still much to do. As he walked away, the note he had left fluttered gently in the breeze. It read, "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts somewhere. Keep it going." The legacy of that day in Central Park continued to grow, inspiring countless others to challenge injustice and demand accountability. Snoop's actions had ignited a spark, but it was the collective voices of those who followed that turned it into a flame. For Snoop Dogg, the story wasn't about him, it was about the people. The bench, the notes, the conversations, they were proof that even the simplest acts could lead to profound change. If this story moved you, share your thoughts. Was it inspiring? Let us know in the comments. Did it resonate, or didn't it? Your feedback helps shape future stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss more meaningful tales like this one. Share your story below. We'd love to hear from you.